All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us today for our IL Social Studies Com. My name is Katie Elbridge. I'm the Social Science Content Specialist. And Kathy, would you like to say hi, introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kathy Rodas, and I work with ELA in social science.
Um, as a side note, feel free, Kathy, do you want them to be able to ask questions as we're going through, or would you prefer they paste them in
Sure.
the chat window? Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have some questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Don't be offended if there's some background noise or feedback from your screen. I may mute you as Kathy's talking just so we can all hear or hear someone else speaking if that works. So if you have a video capabilities, we'd love to see your smiling face this afternoon. If not, we totally understand that that differs for everyone. So, all right, Kathy, go ahead
All
and take it
right.
away.
Thanks. Well, I love this topic, so I could talk all afternoon, but we'll just try to spend a little bit of time talking about how children's literature, which I also want to call it trade books, um, because everyone refers to this topic using different terms like picture books or children's literature. And I think the best way to say it may be trade books, because trade books are things that the public can buy as opposed to textbooks and publisher materials like that. So I may use the terms differently throughout, but it's all referring to children's literature or picture books or nonfiction texts that can be purchased by the public and that can also be used to enhance social science. So let's go ahead and get started. I would, but I am pushing my button and nothing is happening. So hang on. Huh. Everything's frozen. Okay. Here we go. All right. Well, I do want to say before we jump right in, you can just see some of the children's books that are listed. I don't want to call them children's because it's young people books. There are all kinds and all sorts more being written every year. And when we talk about teaching social science, our ultimate goal is to produce these active citizens. There's this big old world out there with different attitudes, different cultures, different geographies, and different perspectives on what's important in one's life. And we want students to not just learn facts behind the electoral process, but to experience it. And so a lot of times that these trade books can offer students a way of kind of getting into history or getting into a different culture through the eyes of people who lived in or live there. And so when looking at children's literature trade books, it can help you imagine a ride beside Paul Revere, or place yourself in a suit of armor, or feel the summer heat of a Malay village. So where textbooks many times can offer an in-depth look, these trade books can. So textbooks is something that a lot of our social science teachers use, or use parts of textbooks to teach the standards with. And they can provide many times an instructional guidance piece, but trade books can also make history come alive. And you can also see primary source documents through them, observe what other cultures may look like in a more in-depth way, also to see realistic photographs. So they're a great tool to use. One of the books right here in the trade books called Midnight Teacher is about Lillian Granderson, who was enslaved and secretly learned to read and write as a child and passed this knowledge on to tons of enslaved people despite the great risks that were involved. And to avoid being noticed from white masters and patrollers, she hosted this school in the middle of the night. And we get to follow through this book Granderson's life pre and post Civil War, including her involvement in educating newly freed Black people in the South. And then in the afterward part of the book, we get to hear what happened to her grandchildren and her great grandchildren, how they went on to become college grads, U.S. congressmen, and more. And so trade books can offer a big look into maybe some more details and excitement around social science. Katie and I have already created some documents that we find would be helpful to kindergarten through 5th grade teachers. And we're going to show you where those are located quickly. But what they are they're grade specific. So there's a document for kindergarten, document for first, and so on. The full standards are included with that, and they address books that are good for inquiry, how other people have taken informed action, and then books that can help them address the civic standards, geography standards, economic standards, as well as history. So if I click on the link on this slide, it's going to take us to our social science page. Hold on, I gotta move things around. There we go.
Kathy, I also did put the link in the chat window if anybody wants to click the link on their computer to kind of follow along to this page.
Thank you. And as I'm scrolling down, by the way, there's the newly released inquiry kit with graphics for each grade level, by the way, that can really help a classroom teacher with the steps to a good inquiry process. So I'll kind of go past those, but you might want to check those out later. And here are our literature connections to the social science standards. So I'll click on 3rd grade just to give you a look at what teachers will find. An overview page, their standards, and then we take the inquiry standards first, which is number 8 of the inquiry standards for this grade level. And we have a book, a description, and then which standard it could connect to. We have a lot of the same books for the inquiry process for all grades, but when you get past the inquiry standards, then you'll get to the civics ones, and they're specific to their grade level. So these will be different for each grade level. And once again, this is not saying it's going to teach that standard. It is a connection to that standard and may be one tool to help get at that standard. So as you can see, as I'm scrolling through, we've found at least one book for each standard and sometimes multiple. And that might be especially helpful for those that may be needing additional resources to use for read alouds, because we know we can never do too many read alouds. And they're fiction, nonfiction, they just run the gamut. So feel free to check those out. And we also know with books being released all the time, how we need to keep updating this as we go. But it's a good start for many of our teachers. Do you have any particular questions about this resource?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. All right. There are a number of different ways to use trade books. One of them could be to introduce new concepts. Engaging students in a topic and allow them to ask questions that could potentially launch an inquiry. I don't know if you've seen this book, The School's on Fire, but this would be a great book when you're talking about how laws and why laws come into being, especially with the American fire laws, because this book follows the path of the December 1958 fire that killed 92 kids and 3 teachers at the Chicago Our Lady of the Angels School. And then about how the fire laws changed after that tragedy. Trade books can also provide alternate perspectives. You'll see here on the screen the book Encounter, which is told by a young, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this Indian tribe correctly, Taino Indian boy's point of view. When Christopher Columbus landed on the island of San Salvador in 1492, this tells it from his point of view and how he tried to warn his people against welcoming these strangers, and how his people seemed more interested in the golden ornaments they could get rather than friendship. And years later, the boy, now an old man, looks back at the destruction of his people and their culture by the colonizers. So that would definitely offer an alternative perspective. Sometimes our textbooks do maybe have one perspective, especially if they're older. And so looking at those and making sure that we provide students all different ways of looking at things that happen in history. Another way to use trade books is to allow for students to pursue maybe things they get interested in based on history. And we can point them to a book that maybe they could read on their own. A couple of them, and you can get so involved at looking at some of these awesome books that are out there now that you'll never step away from it again. My life has been consumed by a book that I discovered when preparing for this that I quickly ordered on Amazon and can't put it down. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But if the slave revolt or slavery is of interest for a student, the Amistad Slave Revolt and American Rebellion is Abolition is a really great book because it includes an account of that slave revolt on the ship when they're bringing slaves to America. Then it also includes some great primary source resources like court cases and summaries of the individuals who were on the slave ships, as well as maps. Another book, when learning about women's rights, Bobby Gibb, particularly if you've got some runners in your classroom, they might be particularly excited about this book when she was not allowed to run on her school's track team. But after school, of course, no one can stop her. She runs endless miles, and then, of course, she tries to get in the Boston Marathon, and they, in 1966, and they say that it's a man's race and that women are not capable of running such a long distance. And so what does she do? She bravely sets out to prove the naysayers wrong and shows them just what the girls can do. It also can showcase ways to resolving conflicts.
Kathy,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a really weird pop-up on my screen that's kind of blocking some of the books.
Is it this pop-up that I can't figure out how to get rid of
There
till
you
my
go.
kids get home?
Kelly Blue.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kelly.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I was
Yeah.
marking like attendance on the registration and didn't catch that right away. Sorry.
Thank you for doing that. Until my kids get home, I can't fix that. So,
No worries.
all right. I think resolving conflicts is a great way to use these books. We're and we can even put this in there. There are great books that help address the social emotional learning standards, which talk about how to, resolve issues without fighting or yelling or screaming or other ways. And so a lot of times these books can showcase ways to resolve conflicts and maybe how did other people resolve conflicts in history. Junebug, I don't know if you've heard of this book. Junebug is a great book. He lives in a low-income project, a project housing, and follows a lot of rules for his safety, but his family members and friends slip into a life of crime and drugs, and how Junebug remains true to the values his mom teaches him. And Someday Is Now is about more than a year before the Greensboro sit-ins. A teacher named Clara Looper led a group of young people to protest the segregated Cat's drugstore by sitting in at the lunch counter. And Then we have another book, also about the same person, different readability level and more primary source documents within this one. Um, it's not only how she showed them with the sit-in in Oklahoma City, but it describes in detail how they were refused to be served then and how they peacefully and passively made their point. Then white customers started spitting on them and pouring sugar and ketchup on their heads. And after a sufficient amount of time, they left. They went home, and then Clara Looper debriefed them about how to handle it the next day. They did so, and on the third day, the store management gave in. And they not only integrated the fountain counter at that location, but also in Missouri and Iowa. Trade books can also allow for different levels of difficulty. And for instance, if in a world geography class, they're looking at the African savanna, and maybe the teacher uses portions of that text to teach about it. Well, if we want the kids to all dig in deeply with it, maybe offer a trade book, which would be at a different readability level than the world geography textbook. But then they also may find another book at a different level. This is from A to Z, reading at the watering hole, as well as maybe an article from ReadWorks at a different level. And those combined together make a text set. And text sets are a great way of allowing kids to not only study the topic at hand, but also to dive in maybe at different reading levels so they can be more independent with that. So it's not to say we can't use the textbook, but maybe we use a portion of that and also portions of other books. When it's a nonfiction text, you can use portions of text, unlike a piece of literature where you're following the story. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these, because if we have a number of books and they're all really lengthy, we may only use a chapter from a nonfiction text or a paragraph, depending on what it is we want to get across to our students. We also want to use trade books to explore topics in greater depth than a textbook can. Hence the book I'm now excited about. I had no idea about this ship that was in Chicago, and I'm finding the year now, 1915. The ship is called the SS Eastland, and there were 2,500 passengers on board, and it capsized in the Chicago River 20 feet from the dock. And more people died on that than the Titanic.
It's more of a book review.
And so, Katie?
I was going to say, I think that one of the things we forget in social studies is that we can talk about children's literature, and Kathy's mentioned they can be our fiction books that we traditionally think of, but these trade books could be nonfiction books that could sort of help round out the sources you're using as your kids are doing an inquiry or an investigation, right? Kathy mentioned our books can help, or trade books can help build student interest. They can get your students questioning, and those questions can guide the inquiry, or I guess, or they can be used in combination to kind of supplement. We know our textbooks or whatever resources we're given may only touch the surface of some things. There may be some great trade books out there that'll talk way more in depth about an event that your kids had a bunch of questions about based on perhaps how they brainstormed questions at the beginning of your unit. So I do think that sometimes we forget that some of our children's books, picture books, some of our books can be nonfiction and can therefore be used to help supplement our investigations that our kids are doing, right? Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we just think that they're there to enhance. kind of the creative side, or that our kids need to think about that. I also think that there's the opportunity, if they've read sort of a historical fiction book, if our kids are able to kind of take a look at that and say, well, wait a second, this matches up with other things I've seen, but this doesn't. This must be something that our author, used creative license on, made up, right? That it's the fiction part of that. So I do think there's a lot of different opportunities, especially in an elementary classroom, but I taught middle school and could see that some of these books, especially our nonfiction sort of trade books, would be a great supplement and probably a little bit more engaging to our students than sometimes those traditional textbooks or other resources might be.
And many times we can just put up a photo or a picture from the book as a way of starting off a class or a unit or an inquiry where they can go through and just, okay, what questions do you have about this photo?
Mm-hmm.
And many times what that does is prepare the kids' brains and gets them ready to um, get excited about whatever they're learning about. And so I think it's a great way to also kick off a unit.
Mm-hmm.
Trade books can also offer greater opportunities for inclusion of various cultures. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about, okay, how do we make sure we provide culturally relevant text to our students? And that's kind of a big topic out there now. So we're going to look at that briefly. What are culturally relevant texts? And this is kind of a quote from Rudine Sims Bishop from Ohio State University. And she's known for the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors analogy for looking at culturally relevant literature. And this is what she says. She says, books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that could be real or imagined, familiar or strange. And these windows can also become sliding glass doors. And readers only have to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. And then she says, when lighting conditions are just right, a window can also be a mirror, which can transform humans' experiences and reflect it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as a part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a self-affirmation, and readers often seek mirrors in books, especially if you have students that don't get to read books where they see people like them in the book, and how important it is that in our classrooms we provide those opportunities for students. So culturally relevant texts can help individual students experience life growing up as a member of a minority culture within a dominant society, such as The House on Mango Street, which this book is used in colleges as well as elementary schools, because it tells of a story of a young Latino girl growing up in Chicago and how she is herself inventing who and what she will become. The name jar is about a student named Yoon Hae, and she is very anxious about American kids liking her. And so she's just here from Korea. And so instead of introducing herself on the first day of school, she tells the class that she's going to choose a name by the following week. And then her classmates are fascinated by this and help by putting out a glass jar and putting names in it for her to pick from. So she's kind of practicing being a Susie or a Laura or an Amanda. And then one day, one of her classmates happens to come to her neighborhood and discovers her real name and the special meaning behind it. And on the day of her name choosing, the jar has been mysteriously has disappeared. And then her friends encourage her to use her Korean name, and then she helps everyone pronounce it. Um, so it really helps others see how difficult it can be a minority in a dominant society. Culturally relevant texts can also engage students' emotions and encourage them to find literature that they like. Um, for instance, Between the Lines, how Ernie Barnes went from the football field to the art gallery, and how this NFL star followed his dreams and became one of the most influential artists of his time. Um, Bloom, I mean, we have kids all the time that are excited about sports and art and fashion, which is what Bloom is all about. In the 1930s, how this young girl in Rome who did not feel pretty at all used her imagination and went from plain to extraordinary and became quite a famous fashion designer. And Elizabeth Warren, about how the importance of being outspoken and how you can use your words to fight for those who need your help. And we can really find out what our kids, especially our kids who just don't find that connection in their classrooms, can find out what they're interested in and maybe use books to help make a connection to them. Um, Culturally relevant texts can also help students see themselves and their culture in artifacts where they can basically see things that like happen to them happen to someone else. This story, One Crazy Summer, is about three sisters who travel to California to meet the mother who abandoned them. And it's a very powerful book. Um, the Patchwork Bike, a group of brothers who don't have much, then use odds and ends to create a patchwork bike and drive it through a village. Um, and then Mommy's, I'm going to say this wrong, Reamer, somebody can correct me in a minute, how a Muslim girl spends a busy day wrapped up in her mother's colorful headscarf, and how special that is. So we can make connections to our students a lot of times through culturally relevant texts. And there's three factors we really want to look at when we're seeing if a text is culturally relevant, and that's the authenticity, if it's realistic, and culturally conscious. And if we look at authenticity, we're really looking at that the book cover reflects the culture, that the vocabulary and the images are accurate to the culture, that the time, dates, and locations are correct, the dialect is correct, and the bracelet is a great example of that. How she goes through the experience of moving, which a lot of our students have experienced that, where they have to move to another town in another district. But when we look deeper in it and see the time frame in it, we know that she is moving to a Japanese internment camp. But this book is phenomenal because it accurately portrays her, her family, and the physical features and color of the culture. We want it to be realistic. The physical features should be portrayed accurately, and the experiences can really happen, and the characters identify themselves as part of the culture. Bureau Genius is a really passionate, touching memoir, and I can't begin to pronounce Victor's last name. You'll see at the bottom of the cover. But he's a highly gifted and imaginative as a child, but he was diagnosed, even though they found out when he was in his 40s that he had extreme dyslexia. They said he had this learning disability, and he was a Latino in an English-only American school in the 1940s. It talks about how he was beaten, not by other kids, by teachers, about the experiences that he had. And this is staying true to what happened to him and the culture and the color and the physical features and the real authentic photos. And culturally conscious is another important piece that we want to look at. What's the author's underlying message? And here's the main thing. If a text discusses that the culture, a culture assimilating into the mainstream culture and their culture being completely forgotten, then the text is not being culturally conscious. For example, in Going Someplace, this is of a young African American girl who's sad that she's unable to do the things that Caucasian individuals are able to do and go to. And in the end, the girl basically understands that things are the way they are. And even though she cannot fit in everywhere due to segregation, there are places that she can go that are special. And she feels good about who she is at the end, and it doesn't matter that she's a part of the mainstream culture. Sometimes we're not sure whether or not a text is culturally relevant, and there's a rubric. There's probably other rubrics out there. I like this one in particular, and Katie's making a Google Drive for us that have all these resources in it. This rubric included.
It's already shared in the chat, but I'll share it again here before the end so that they can check them all out.
And this rubric is nice to look at. Like, I used the book, The Color of Home, and I went through after looking through the book, I scored it. And so it was excellent, except for on the second one, where the book is written and illustrated by someone who shares the culture. And so I gave it a 0 because it's by Mary Hoffman. But when I looked her up, I read that she had spent time in this culture with the people of this culture and did a phenomenal job. So I knew that was not going to be the deal breaker for me, but it's something to look at. So we want to make sure that it's validating their culture, that the student who reads the book can share some of the same cultural markers with the main character, that if we want to give it to a student to look at, that it needs to be around the same age or gender as close as possible. This one would for the classroom that I was thinking of. The dialect has not been changed, and so it met that, as well as the rest of this rubric. Just kind of giving us an indicator whether this would be a good text to include in our classroom. Now, probably the part that you're most excited about is resources for finding these picture books and literature and nonfiction, or what we'll call trade books, that we can look through. And, thinking as a classroom teacher, you already know the units and the topics according to your standards that you're to address. And we know our Illinois social science standards are not so specific that you don't get choice. And once you've figured out what you're doing to meet those standards, then look at some of these resources and saying, where can I take and add to and enhance, or even books that students can read on their own to make that social science come alive. So the first one we already took you to is, once again, on that link at the website. We'll give you your grade-specific standards and some books to start with. The National Council for Social Studies. It comes out with notable trade books for young people every year. And so I'm going to click on the link on this slide. And then the 2019 books we're including in your Google Drive for you. But if you click on that link, it's going to take you to the website where, if you scroll a little bit, you're going to not only see the 2019 list, but the past lists. So there may not be something in the 2019 list that maybe fits the topic you're addressing. Well, that doesn't mean you can't go to 2016. Click on that, because what they have done for you is they've determined if it's culturally relevant also. So they've kind of done some of the homework for us, but I clicked on 2016, and then as I scroll through it, you're going to see, well, you'll get all details on who looked through them. They have them organized by biography, contemporary concerns, environment, energy, ecology, folk tales, geography, history. Then they'll have world history also. And so they have it nicely organized and a key to let you find even more specific resources for possibly in your classroom. So that is one excellent resource that has been vetted by the finest social studies minds out there. All right, the next resource is Notable Books for Global Society. And the link is for that as well. I'm going to click on that link. And there may be some books in this list that are also in the list we just looked at, and that's fine. But what you'll do is you'll go to the book list here, or you can nominate a book. And then once I click on that, the only thing it doesn't give you is a description. That's what I would want. So it does give you a list, but it doesn't have a description about them. Okay, but that would be one resource you could check out. The next resource is the website, The Best Children's Books. And they have a section of American history books and world history books. So I'm going to click on the American history books. And let me show you what I like about this. My favorite feature. All right. When I scroll, they already let you pick a topic. And, oh, here's the book Encounter on the Age of Exploration. That's the one about the Indian getting his point of view about Columbus. So if I click on Age of Exploration, that's going to take me to a number of books, okay, about the exploration. See how many they have? And it gives you grade level ideas. Okay? So I like how that's organized. All right. The same thing with the world history books. It's organized that way too. Then there's a list of culturally relevant literature for classroom use, which is compiled by the Closing the Achievement Gap branch. And let me show you what that looks like. When you click on that link, it'll take you to this list, or we have the list in the Google Drive. And it is organized by cultural. For example, the first thing you see are going to be a lot of titles that are African American literature titles by grade level. So they start off with kindergarten and first, and then they let you know if there's a big book available too. There's quite a few kindergarten and first, second and third, more second and third, fourth and fifth, middle school, high school. Then there's American Indian titles, organized by grade level, Hawaiian American, organized by grade level, Mexican American, and once again, organized by grade level. I don't know if you've been to the Mighty Girl Books website, but it's an exciting website to look at, and they have a number of books. I'm going to click on the link, And they have filters on this one for you to narrow down your focus. For example, on the left-hand side, I'm going to click History and Biography. And then I'm going to, I could narrow down and say it United States. And then I can narrow it down. Oh, I can narrow it down from there, but I'm not going to. I'm going to pick 9-year-olds to 12-year-olds. Okay. Click that. And then I have a nice list. And it even gives you how much it costs. But then check Amazon. And check and see if you can get used books also. But I'm just like, oh, I just had no idea some of the books that were out there that I think can really connect with our students. And of course, these are all about empowering girls. So all of the books are about a mighty girl. All right, there's that website. Then there's a list, which will also be in the Google Drive, of notables for a global society. And these are the 2019 winners that you could check out as well. A lot of these are on other lists as well. Okay. And the International Literacy Association every year does Children's Choice Awards. And you will have this in your Google Drive as well, because they're not all that easy to find. So these are kind of divided up, and they give you grade specific. And many of these will address the not only they have science books in there too, but they also address some social science standards as well. So you just kind of have to kind of go through it because it's all books. But it's another great list to look at as well. Oops. All right. And that was the final slide.
Okay. Kathy, do you want to show them the Google Drive real quick, or do you want me to?
I'll let you do that.
Okay.
So I'm going to stop share.
So in the chat window, I just pasted a couple of links, and one of them is to a Google Drive where Kathy's put some of those book lists and resources for you. So I did also, Kathy, while you were going through some of those slides, some of those early resource slides that were links to an external place like the National Council for the Social Studies and those that went to a website, those slides will be in here on a PDF so that you guys can click on those links if you wanted to go directly to those slides. A few of the others, like the National Literacy Association, is downloaded already there for you. If you are watching this recording after the fact and wonder how you can get to the Google Drive, because I know you can't see our chat, on our ILSSCom page, if you scroll down a little bit, kind of in the middle of the page, we have a little discussion board where you're welcome to ask questions after the fact or post some information. The link to the Google Drive is in there if you wanted to check it out. And our archived video, of course, you will have found at the bottom of the page if you're watching this as a recording. But Kathy was gracious enough to find all those different lists, including that rubric that she used to evaluate the culturally relevant texts is also in the Google Drive. So I wanted to share that real quick. Are there any questions? I know we have just a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions we can help clear up? Okay. Then in the chat window, I also put a link to the post survey. It should pull up as the same, it's the same link as the pre-survey you took. You'll just have to select post. When you go in, there's just a few reflection questions in there. In that post survey, there's also some information that we're asking for about what sessions or topics are you interested in hearing more about in the future. We are right now in the process of trying to schedule some of the IL Social Studies comms for the rest of the school year. So let us know what you would like to hear more about, so we can make sure to try to get those topics in if we can. So, all right.